Oyez, oyez, oyez. All rise. The Honorable Judge Janelle Taha presiding.
You may be seated. We are here in the United States District Court in Missouri to hear the case of United States versus John Brown, Sr. You are admonished, all of you, that this is a courtroom of the United States of America, that you are to be very serious about the job to be done today. We appreciate the work of all counsel and the demeanor of all counsel that will respect the role of this court. Counsel, will you state your appearances?
Morley Swingle and Justin Smith for the prosecution.
Thank you. Counsel?
Thank you, Your Honor. It's my pleasure to appear on behalf of my client, Mr. John Brown, Sr. My name is Frank Bowman, and with me today is my co-counsel, Lindsay Laws.
Thank you, counsel. It is my understanding that prior to this trial, there may be pretrial motions, and I have been advised that there's a defense pretrial motion. Is that correct?
That is correct, Your Honor, if I may address the court. If I could have the defense exhibits up, please. Your Honor, the defense would like to make a motion for change of venue pursuant to Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 21A on the ground that, pursuant to the rule, so great a prejudice against the defendant exists in the transferring district, that would be here, that the defendant cannot obtain a fair and impartial trial here. Now, the court is, of course, aware that my client, John Brown, was captured in Osawatomie, Kansas, while resisting an invasion of an armed mob of pro-slavery ruffians from Missouri, a mob that murdered his son, Frederick. Mr. Brown was turned over to Kansas authorities in the person of Judge Sterling Cato, the same man who sought to have Mr. Brown arrested for no other reason than that he opposed slavery and the black laws passed by the bogus pro-slavery Kansas legislature. A legislature put in office by fraud and violence, perpetrated once again by armed gangs of pro-slavery Missouri thugs. Now, as Your Honor is aware, we asked Judge Cato to disqualify himself and to grant a change of venue outside the territory of Kansas. And that motion was based, of course, on both on his personal bias and the fact that the black laws disqualify from jury service in Kansas all those Kansans with anti-slavery views. Now, Judge Cato granted the motion, but in what can only be viewed as a perverse and vicious joke, Cato transferred the case here to Boone County, Missouri. Now, we are grateful to have a judge of Your Honor's high reputation and undoubted impartiality, but it is impossible to conceive that an impartial jury can be seated in this county. Now, consider John Brown, my client, is known across the United States as a passionate opponent of slavery. He is here on trial for his life for supposedly murdering 5 pro-slavery men. But if we consider where we sit in 1857 in Boone County, we have a population of 19,000. 5,000 of those persons are slaves. This is the 3rd largest slaveholding county in Missouri. We are in the heart of Little Dixie, the line of the 6 largest slaveholding counties running along the Missouri River up to the Kansas border, from Callaway to Boone to Howard to Saline to Lafayette to Jackson. Moreover, in addition to the population of the county generally, Your Honor, all of the prominent members of the Boone County population and the Boone County community are in fact not only pro-slavery, but in fact slave owners themselves. And indeed, from looking at the courtroom before we began, several of them are in fact here tonight. For example, we have with us tonight James S. Rollins. Are you out there, Mr. Rollins? There he is indeed. Mr. Rollins, the sort of man you might name a street after, is a university booster, a former county attorney, state representative, and he is now, in fact, running for governor of the state of Missouri, and he is, ladies and gentlemen, the second largest slaveholder in this county, as well as being the second largest taxpayer. Mr. William Switzler, are you present, sir? Mr. Switzler, the editor of the fine newspaper in Boone County, the Missouri Statesman, a pioneering journalist, a state representative, and a slave owner. And finally, David H. Hickman.
Would you
Mr. Hickman.
refrain from comments in the courtroom?
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Hickman is a landowner. He's a former legislator. He's actually the founder of the Columbia Female Baptist Academy, and he, too, is a slave owner and one of the largest in Boone County. And in fact, these three men are merely representative of the population that we find, the population from which a jury must be drawn to try my client, and therefore, Your Honor, we move for a change of venue.
Does the state wish to respond?
Your Honor, all of that was well and good and mildly interesting, but the purpose of voir dire is to find a jury of fair and impartial jurors. To get his change of venue, he would have to show that he could not get a fair trial in Boone County. In fact, it's a bit of an insult to Boone County to even have made this motion. We went through the voir dire process. You weeded out for cause the jurors who said they were biased one way or another. Some were pro-slavery, some were anti-slavery. We are left with 12 people who have said under oath they can be fair to both sides, and his motion should be denied. If you were going to try to find a jury that had not heard of John Brown, it would be possible in the territory of Kansas, it would be possible in Missouri. Even the cattle in the field have heard of John Brown. But the test is, can you find people who can be fair who have not already formed opinions? And these 12 jurors have sworn that they can be fair to both sides.
Thank you, counsel. Thank you, counsel. This court finds that this jury can be fair and impartial. We'll give this defendant a fair trial. We'll look at all the evidence as they should. We'll pay attention to the jury instructions. The motion is denied. The jury has previously been impaneled. Will the members of the jury please stand? Are there any objections by either counsel to this panel of jurists? Then would each of the jurors raise your hand and repeat after me? Actually, simply answer, I do after me. Do you swear that you will faithfully execute your duties as a juror by deciding this case based upon the evidence and the law given to you by this court? Your answer would be, I do. Thank you. You may be seated. You are doing a very important service for the people of the United States of America. Take this duty seriously. Always, when called for jury duty, be ready and available for the court to use you in the fact-finding process. The following instructions of law are for your guidance in this case. These instructions, along with other instructions in writing that will be read to you at the close of all the evidence, will be handed to you at the time you go to the jury room. Instruction number 1. This is a criminal case. The United States of America has charged the defendant, John Brown Sr., has committed 5 counts of first-degree murder. Each count of the indictment alleges that John Brown did unlawfully and with malice aforethought kill another human being. And there is a separate count of the indictment for each alleged victim: John Doyle, William Doyle, Drury Doyle, Alan Wilkinson, and William Sherman. The United States is seeking the death penalty for these offenses based on the allegation that the defendant committed them in the course of committing an act of domestic terrorism. The defendant has pleaded not guilty to all of these charges. Thus, there are issues of fact that must be decided by a jury subject to these instructions concerning the law and all of the instructions that the court will give to the jury. The jury is obligated to follow these instructions. Faithful performance by you of your duties as jurors is vital to the administration of justice. You should perform your duties without prejudice or fear, and solely from a fair and impartial consideration of the whole case. Instruction number 2. In a moment, the attorneys for the government and the defense will give their opening statements. The opening statements of these attorneys are not evidence. Also, do not consider as evidence any statement or argument by any of the attorneys addressed to another attorney or to this court. However, if the attorneys enter into agreements or stipulations of fact, then those agreements and stipulations become part of the evidence and are to be considered by you as such. Likewise, you must not assume as true any fact solely because it is included in or suggested by a question to any witness. A question is not evidence. The indictment in this case is not evidence, and it creates no inference at all, that any offense was committed or that the defendant is guilty of any of the offenses charged. Counsel, are you prepared to make your opening statements?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
May it please the court. On Saturday night, May 24th, 1856, this defendant, John Brown, masterminded and carried out the brutal murders of 5 men: James Doyle, age 39, William Doyle, age 22, Drury Doyle, age 20, Alan Wilkinson, age 39, and William Sherman, age 35. The terror began that night at 11 o'clock when John Brown and his gang of killers invaded the home of James Doyle and his family. When the killers invaded her home, Doyle's wife, who was named Mahala, begged the killers to leave her husband and her sons alone. John Brown and his gang of killers refused, and they forced James Doyle and his 2 oldest sons, William and Drury, outside, where they slaughtered them to death with broadswords. John Brown and his gang of killers stabbed James Doyle in the chest and shot him in the head. John Brown and his gang of killers hacked open the skull, jaw, and side of 22-year-old William Doyle. John Brown and his gang of killers stabbed 20-year-old Drury Doyle in the chest, chopped open his head, and cut off his fingers as he held them up in a feeble attempt to protect himself. After John Brown and his gang of killers had murdered James Doyle and his 2 oldest sons, John Brown and his gang disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a sobbing widow and the 2 Doyle children they had deemed too young to murder. John Brown and his gang of killers struck next at the home of Alan Wilkinson and his family. When the killers invaded her home, Wilkinson's wife, Louisa, who was terribly sick, begged John Brown to spare her husband so he could care for her in her time of need. John Brown coldly replied that her neighbors could care for her. Alan Wilkinson asked to at least be allowed to put on his boots. John Brown refused, knowing Wilkinson would not be walking far. He forced Wilkinson outside, and just 150 yards from Alan Wilkinson's front door, John Brown and his gang slaughtered Wilkinson by slashing him in his head and side with swords and by chopping him in the head. John Brown and his gang of killers ended their murder spree that night at the home of James Harris and his family. When the killers invaded the Harris home, it was about 3 hours after the Doyle murders, so approximately 2 a.m., still the middle of the night. John Brown and his gang barged into the bedroom of James Harris and his wife with drawn swords and guns and terrorized them. They ransacked the home and forced one of the Harris's overnight guests, William Sherman, outside. Once they had Sherman outside, John Brown and his gang split open Sherman's skull with their swords, stabbed him in the chest, and chopped off his left hand as he helplessly tried to ward off the slashes of the sword. You will hear tonight that this defendant, John Brown, masterminded and led this midnight raid of terror. John Brown cold-bloodedly and deliberately killed these 5 men, not because they had ever personally done him wrong, but because politically their beliefs differed from his. You will hear tonight from James Townsley, one of the men who rode with John Brown and his gang that night, who will tell you that Brown used Townsley, a native of the Pottawatomie Creek area, to point out the homes of pro-slavery men. John Brown dragged these men from their beds in the middle of the night and killed them in cold blood for the express purpose of intimidating and terrorizing other pro-slavery settlers. John Brown is a cold-blooded killer who invaded the homes of these 5 men and slaughtered them to terrorize and intimidate other citizens of Kansas. At the close of this trial, we will ask that you find John Brown guilty of these 5 murders and that you sentence him to death. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Are you prepared with your opening statement?
Yes, Your Honor. May it please the court? Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the government has told you a pretty interesting story tonight about what happened at Potawatomi, but it's just that. It's a story. The government has told you that they will present this evidence to support this story, the supposed story that John Brown is a murderer. Certainly the government is going to furnish evidence tonight, but it's not going to be able to furnish enough to meet its burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt the accusations against my client, John Brown. The reason the government will not be able to give you the evidence necessary to convict my client is because reasonable, reliable, and unbiased evidence does not exist. You're going to hear testimony tonight not only from John Brown, but also from Salmon Brown and from Theodore Weiner, both of whom were at Potawatomi the night the decedents were killed. And all of them will tell you that my client didn't kill anyone that night. Additionally, there are going to be citizens of Potawatomi testifying before you today. None of them will tell you that my client killed anyone that night. The only person who's going to say tonight that John Brown killed anyone is James Townley, a man who admittedly took part in the killings and then turned tail and made a deal with the government which kept him from being hanged so long as he agreed to testify against John Brown. The simple fact is that the state does not have the evidence necessary to support the charges against Mr. Brown. Even if you are to conclude the contrary, however, the evidence brought forth tonight will show that the deaths of the decedents were justified. The evidence presented in this case will show that Mr. Brown is an honest, hardworking, God-fearing man who is deeply opposed to slavery and its horrific and brutal fruits. Due to his abhorrence of slavery and his despair that it might spread to Kansas, Mr. Brown came to Kansas territory to help establish it as a free state. In doing so, he chose to confront the ultimate evil of slavery where it needed to be confronted. He chose to work towards Kansas becoming a free state, a state where his fellow human beings would not be kept in bondage, would not be abused, and would not be treated and sold like property. Mr. Brown and other abolitionists would have certainly liked to have undertaken this work with peaceful political means, had the pro-slavers allowed it. But they didn't. Tonight, you're going to hear ample testimony of how any opportunity to build a free state by peaceful means was stolen by these ruffians. You're going to hear how these vicious scoundrels, many of them pro-slavery Missourians, stole the 1855 election by, in the words of one of their own spokesmen, entering every election district in Kansas and voting at the point of bowie knife and rifle. And even though a congressional committee investigated the election and determined that it had been stolen by fraud and violence, the federal government refused to invalidate the election. They refused to right the wrong. Instead, it confirmed, if not condoned, the outcome of the mockery of democracy. As a result of the stolen election, the legislative body of the territory of Kansas was controlled almost entirely by pro-slavers, who owed their office to blatant and unabashed fraud. One of the decedents, Alan Wilkinson, was a member of this legislature. This bogus legislator then enacted laws supporting their views of slavery and punishing those who disagreed with them. And tonight you're going to see those laws yourself. You are going to see the laws that Wilkinson helped enact. You, the jury, will be able to read with your own eyes the law stating that no person who held anti-slavery views was allowed to vote or could serve on a jury. You're going to read the law stating that any person who spoke, wrote, or acted in any manner to encourage a slave to escape was guilty of a felony, and it was a felony punishable by death. Additionally, you're going to hear evidence about how the so-called representatives in this bogus legislature packed the judiciary. It wasn't enough that those opposed to slavery would break the law simply by speaking their opinion. Instead, the pro-slavers made sure that no one opposed to slavery could get a fair trial. And pro-slavers also used the judiciary to carry out their schemes and to punish those who disagreed with them by issuing warrants for their arrest. In fact, two of the decedents, William and Drury Joyle, had the task of executing warrants against free staters who had come to the attention of the judiciary. The injustices and the atrocities didn't stop there, however. You're going to hear tonight about how pro-slavery Missourians poured over the border into Kansas and laid siege to the peaceful town of Lawrence, a town which committed no crime, except having the majority of its citizens believe that Kansas should be a free state. You're also going to hear about how residents of Kansas who were anti-slavery were threatened in their own town by their own neighbors, all because they desired that Kansas be kept free from the taint of slavery. In fact, one of the decedents, William Sherman, took parts in these acts of intimidation, repeatedly threatening to shoot and exterminate Free Staters and declaring that he was gladly awaiting the war that was going to start with the Free Staters. And as Theodore Weiner, who is a Free Stater, will testify tonight, Sherman even went so far as to threaten Weiner's life in an effort to coerce him to leave his home and to leave the county within 3 days. And finally tonight, you're going to hear that immediately prior to the events that spawned this trial, the bloody hands of slavery reached into the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. and almost took the life of an anti-slavery senator. You will hear how Senator Sumner, who was busy at his desk doing the people's work, was attacked in a surprise attack by a cane-wielding congressman who was angry that Senator Sumner had spoken against slavery. And you will hear that Senator Sumner, who couldn't even defend himself because his legs were trapped by his desk, almost died because of the brutality that took place in our nation's capital by those who supported slavery. After you hear this evidence tonight, the defense is going to ask you to consider what choices a Free Stater really had. To sit still while settlements were being burned and Free Staters were being threatened by their very neighbors, and all the while the legal system and the local, state, and federal governments did nothing to stop the terrorism. To sit and to watch as the vile evil of slavery came closer to Kansas, without the ability to oppose it through the law, and without even the right to live peacefully with anti-slavery opinions. Or under the circumstances, did a Free State settler have little choice other than to finally strike back at those who had taken away his rights and his ability to stop the spread of slavery through lawful and peaceful means? Now, at the end of this evidence today, the defense is going to ask that you find John Brown not guilty of these charges against him. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Thank you, counsel. You have a response.
Your Honor, the prosecution's first witness is Mahala Doyle.
Prosecution calls Mahala Doyle.
Ma'am, would you state your name for the jury, please?
Mahala Doyle.
And you may need to speak up so they can hear you as far away as they're sitting. What is your name again?
Mahala Doyle.
And how old are you?
I'm 41.
Now, can you tell the jury where you live?
Yes, my family settled in the area of just about 1 mile north of where the Mosquito Creek enters into the river.
Now, who lived with you back in May of 1856?
My husband and my 4 children.
And can you describe for the jury the ages of your husband and your children?
Yes. My husband, James, was 45 when he was killed by John Brown. My children numbered 4 until that night, and I had 3 sons. William was 22, Drury was 20, my son John is 14, and then my daughter Polly-Ann was 10 that night.
I'd like to show you 3 exhibits that are marked States Exhibits 1, 2, and 3. Are each of these photographs of your son William, your son Drury, and your husband James Doyle?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'd offer States Exhibits 1, 2, and 3.
No objection, Your Honor.
They will be admitted.
If you would, I'm showing you now up on the screen, who is this photograph of?
That's my husband, James.
And the next photograph? Who is this?
My son, William.
And how old was he?
He was 22.
And the next photograph?
That was my son, Drury. He was 20.
Thank you. Now, can you describe for me on the night of May 24th, 1856, had you gone to bed that night, a Saturday night?
Yes, it was late.
And can you describe for the jury around 11 o'clock that night what, if anything, woke you up?
Yes. I woke up to the sound of our dogs barking, and then they just stopped suddenly. And so I wasn't sure what was going on, but then I heard something in the yard. Sure enough, there were men out there, and they began knocking at our door and calling out, "James Doyle, James Doyle." And so my husband walked to the door just to see what was going on, and he asked them what they wanted. And they told him they just wanted to know where Alan Wilkinson lived. And Mr. Wilkinson was our neighbor. He lived less than a mile away from us. So my husband started to tell them. He opened the door, and the men just barged in. There were several of them, not really sure, but at least 5. And then the men demanded that they were from the Army, and my husband and my sons needed to surrender. They were now their prisoners.
Can you tell the jury, were these men armed in any way?
Oh, certainly, yes. They carried pistols and they had swords on them, which is, I'm sure, why my husband surrendered.
Now, did there seem to be one man who was the leader of the others?
Yes, one man.
And describe him.
The man was tall and thin, and he had this thinnish face and kind of bushy hair.
And can you describe for the jury who was doing most of the talking?
It was that man.
Now, describe for the jury, then you said that they were talking with your husband. Relate for us the conversation.
Well, really, all that happened was my husband started to tell them where Alan Wilkinson lived, and then they were demanding that my husband surrender, and my sons as well. And then they didn't really have much conversation because they started to drag my family out the door.
Who all were they taking?
They were taking all of my sons, John, William, and Drury, and then my husband, James.
Now, your youngest son, John, was how old?
He was only 14. He was just a boy.
What did you do?
I was crying. I was just begging for them to just leave him be.
And who were you begging?
I was begging mostly John Brown.
And what was his response finally?
His response was to leave my son. He didn't say anything.
So he left your 14-year-old son?
Yes.
Took your husband and your 2 older sons?
Yes.
Once they went outside, did you go outside yourself?
No, I was afraid for my life and for my 2 leftover children.
What, if anything, did you see or hear?
Well, I shut the door just to be safe. And then, not 2 minutes later, I heard the report of pistols.
And
Or
so,
it could have just been 1 pistol, I'm not sure.
how many shots did you hear?
There were 2.
And what was the timing of when you heard the shots compared to when you had closed your door?
It really couldn't have been more than 2 minutes. It was just a couple of moments.
Now, that night then, after this happened around 11 o'clock, did you go back to bed?
No. It was a sleepless night for me and my son. He was old enough to know.
And during the darkness, did you ever get the courage to go outside?
No, certainly not.
Tell the jury what happened at daybreak.
At daybreak, I decided that I was going to go look for my sons and my husband. I was hoping that they could still be alive. And then I happened upon my husband and my son, William.
Can you describe for the jury about how far were they from your home?
Yes, they were not more than 200 yards from my home.
And tell the jury what you found when you found your husband.
My husband had been shot in the forehead, and he also had been stabbed in his chest.
And did you end up meeting with me and marking on a diagram where those injuries were?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'd offer this diagram at this time.
Any objection? No objection, Your Honor.
Looking at State's Exhibit 6, can you describe for the jury where was that bullet hole in the head?
It was right on his forehead.
And is this diagram a fair and accurate depiction of where that bullet hole was?
Yes.
And as to the wound on your husband's chest, where was it located?
It was right above his heart.
And does that diagram accurately depict where it was?
Yes.
Now, after you had seen the injuries to your husband, where was your oldest son, William's body, compared to your husband's?
William was laying right next to my husband. I'm sure my husband had tried to protect him if he could have.
And describe then the injuries you saw to your son, William.
William had a big gash in his jaw, and he'd also had his head cut open. And he also had been cut in the side.
And did you meet with me and diagram for me the injuries you saw to William?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'd offer that diagram, State's Exhibit 7. State's Exhibit 7 at this time.
No objections. You may.
And using this diagram, would you point out to the jury where was the injury to the head?
Yes. He'd been cut in his head. His head was open and exposed.
And where was the injury to the jaw?
It was right here. He had a gash in his jaw.
And as far as the gash, can you give a little more detail about that?
It was right down to the bone. I didn't look very long.
And then what was the other injury to your son, William?
He'd been stabbed in the side.
Now, after you found the bodies of your husband and your oldest son, what went through your mind in regard to your younger son, Drury?
Well, I thought if Drury wasn't with them, he must still be alive. And so I frantically began looking for him, hoping he'd been hiding or he'd escaped somehow. But that was not the case.
Where did you find him?
I found him not far from there. He was in a grassy ravine near our home.
And would you describe the condition of his body?
Yes. What they did to my son was an abomination. They had cut into his head. They'd cut it right open, so everything was exposed. And then they'd also stabbed him in the chest. But the worst of it all was that they had cut off every one of his fingers.
Now, we have a diagram, I believe it's State's Exhibit 8, that you had prepared showing his injuries. Can you show us where the injury to his head is?
Yes. On his head, he'd been cut right here, cut open, just slaughtered open.
And where was the injury to his chest?
It was right in the middle.
Right where his heart is?
Yes.
And again, describe the injuries to his fingers?
They'd just been cut off. Parts of his hand were missing, too.
Now, ma'am, did you ultimately have a funeral for your husband and your sons?
We did, but we had to wait until the next day to do it because we were still looking for all of the parts of my son.
Did you ultimately find all of his fingers?
Yes.
And you see in the courtroom today the man who, when he came into your home, was doing most of the talking, the man who appeared to be the leader of the group that came and took your husband and your two sons out of the home, and you then found them dead?
Yes.
And which person is that?
Right over there.
And would you identify what he's wearing?
Yes. The man with the dark-colored coat and the light-colored pants and the boots and with the big gray hair.
Your Honor, may the record reflect that the witnesses identified the defendant.
The record will reflect that.
No further questions.
Mrs. Doyle, prior to cross-examination, the court failed to have you sworn. Would you stand up and swear that the testimony that you have given and will give is the truth? Bailiff, will you?
Do you swear to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. We won't tell the Court of Appeals that.
We have the defense exhibits, please. Now, Mrs. Doyle, I'm very sorry for your loss.
I'm sure.
Your husband and your sons were all pro-slavery men, as I understand it. Is that not correct?
Most men in the territory were.
But is the answer to the question that your husband and your sons were pro-slavery men?
Yes, we never even owned a slave, though.
You're at some pains to emphasize that your family did not own slaves, but your husband and your sons were strong pro-slavery men, correct?
No, I wouldn't identify it as that.
But in any case, you say you don't own slaves, but they were pro-slavery. So I guess we can conclude that, lacking even the sordid excuse of personal financial gain, your menfolk dedicated themselves to the cause of enslaving other human beings purely as a matter of principle.
Objection is argumentative, right?
Could you rephrase that question?
I'll let it stand, Your Honor, as it is. Now, you suggest, I gather, that your menfolk were not dedicated to the cause of promoting slavery. Is that correct?
That is exactly what I proposed.
Okay. Now, you arrived in Kansas in November of 1855, did you not?
Yes.
To settle in Kansas.
Yes.
And you arrived at an unimproved plot of land and began to improve it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you arrived in the midst of winter, or the onset of winter in 1855 in the wilderness. And you began, I assume, building a house and improving your claim. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And so springtime rolled around, April or so of the next year, and that would have been a busy time for a farmer, I trust, clearing the fields and the brush and preparing for the plowing and planting.
Well, certainly.
Yes. But in April of 1856, Your husband and your sons, rather than plowing and planting, went down to the court being held by Judge Sterling Cato at Dutch Henry's Tavern and volunteered to serve arrest warrants on John Brown and his sons. Isn't that true?
Actually, I believe that they were asked to do so.
Oh, but they agreed, did they not?
Well, certainly. They have to keep the laws.
Ah, well, let's talk about that a bit. They were, in fact, enumerated as the persons who were going to serve these warrants, these peaceful farmers.
Yes, deputy constables, you could call them.
And you expressed some bitterness against my client. But of course, you don't actually know who killed your husband and sons, do you?
Well, it certainly looks like him over there.
Well, but you were inside the house when your husband and your sons died, were you not?
That's true.
Now, whoever it was, when the men came to take away your menfolk, you were not armed.
No.
And if I might approach the witness, Your Honor. Knowing what you know now, Mrs. Doyle, knowing what you know now, if you had been armed, what would you have done?
If I had been armed?
Yes.
Well, I would have tried to defend my children, but I'm not much with guns.
But you would have fought,
Well, certainly.
and you would have killed if necessary to protect them,
To protect my children.
because these men were taking away your family.
Yes.
But you never fought. You never protested when your menfolk claimed, as a matter of principle, the right of white men to tear black men from their wives and children, did you?
I don't believe my men protested for that right.
Now, perhaps you think that killing is different than merely separating families, but I'd like you to take a look at this warrant that your husband and your sons were assigned to serve. Do you know the offenses that it charged, ma'am?
I'm not familiar with that document, sir.
All right. Your Honor, by the way, I'd move the admission of government's, or rather Defendant's Exhibit B. I'd ask that the court take judicial notice of the document as it is a court document.
We'd agreed not to object to the foundation. No objection.
Admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. And you'll see, ma'am, that the warrant that your husband and your sons attempted to execute was an act to punish offenses against slavery, slave property, 1855. Correct? You see that, do you not?
Sir, I don't read.
Well, I trust the jury does, and they can see that. Now, do you know, whether you read or not, what the penalty for that violation of that statute is, ma'am?
No, I do not.
Your Honor, I'd like to have the court take judicial notice of Defendant's Exhibit C, an act to punish offenses against slave property, 1855.
No objection.
And, Your Honor, I'd like the jury to be able to observe that the penalty for violations of Section 2 and 3, the sections charged in the warrant, the sections charged in the warrant that the deceased attempt to execute on my client, is death. And death. And the crime, do you know what the crime is?
Well, perhaps it was all the trouble that they were causing, threatening people.
Perhaps what was charged was enticing, decoying, or persuading a man to be free. And for that, Mrs. Doyle, your husband and his sons sought the death of my client. Isn't that right?
Well, I suppose it is.
No further questions.
Mrs. Doyle, whatever these various documents that he has shown you, the fact of the matter is, was your husband armed that night?
No, he was not.
Was your son William armed that night?
No.
Was
It
your
was the
son-
middle of the night.
Was your son Drury armed?
No.
No further questions.
Thank you, counsel. Thank you, Mrs. Doyle. You're excused. The prosecution will call its next witness.
The next witness is Louisa Jane Wilkinson.
Mrs. Mrs. Wilkinson, will you come forward and be sworn? Would you step up to the bailiff and be sworn, please?
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
You may be seated. You may proceed, counsel.
Would you state your name for the jury, please?
Louisa Jane Wilkinson.
And you may need to speak up to be sure that all of them can hear you. What is your name?
Louisa Jane Wilkinson.
And can you tell the jury where did you live back on May 24th of 1856?
Near Mosquito Creek.
And who did you live with?
My former husband, Alan Wilkinson.
And who else lived in the home?
Our two children, Wesley and Madeline.
And what were their ages?
10, Wesley, and 6, Madeline.
Now, was your husband a pro-slavery man?
Yes, sir, he was.
Give us a brief description of his pro-slavery activities that you know of.
Well, he was a postmaster and a member of the pro-slavery legislation. He was a PA for the Judge Cato's court for free statesmen at Dutch Henry's Tavern.
When you say he was a PA for Judge Cato's court, what do you mean by that? A prosecutor?
Yes, he was a prosecuting attorney.
Now, we have a map of your neighborhood that's been identified as, I believe, State's Exhibit 11 that you previously looked at. Your Honor, I'd offer State's Exhibit 11 at this time.
Any objections?
No objection, Your Honor.
It'll be admitted.
Now, ma'am, do you recognize this map as being a map of your community?
Yes, sir, I do.
And would you show the jury using this map, and you may need to get up to move close to see this red dot. This red dot doesn't appear to be working too well. You may need to get really close. Would you invade the space of defense counsel here? And this one might work better. All right, show the jury. First of all, show them where Potawatomi Creek is located.
Well, I do declare, Mr. Swingle, this is quite an invention. Maybe you could come up with indoor plumbing.
So Potawatomi Creek is on the red dot you're
Yes, sir.
putting along there. And then show us where Mosquito Creek is.
Let's see, I believe it's here.
And then where is your home, the Doyle home?
The Doyle home? The Doyle home is up here. But I am the Wilkinson home, so I would be down here.
Yes. So the Doyles lived up north of you. About how far did the Doyles live from you?
Yes, sir. Just a few miles up the road.
And then where was your home?
Right there.
And are you familiar with where Dutch Henry lived?
Right there.
And there was a James Harris that lived next door to Dutch Henry. About where would his house have been?
Right about there.
Thank you. Let me go ahead and have a seat. Now, ma'am, were you home on the night of Saturday night, May 24th, 1856?
Yes, sir, I was. I was very sick with the measles.
And was your husband and your two children there with you?
Yes, sir, they were.
And did you go to bed that night, your whole family?
Oh, yes, we did.
Did something happen in the middle of the night that woke you up?
Well, yes, we heard the dogs barking. Well, I should say I heard the dogs barking.
Describe what happened then.
Well, I tried to wake up my husband. He's deaf as a doorknob. And I said, Mr. Wilkinson. He heard nothing. And I said, Mr. Wilkinson. He heard nothing again. So I used my wifely voice and said, Alan. And he said, yes, dear. And so I said, Alan, I hear something outside. And he said, well, what do you hear? And I said, the dogs are barking, and I think I just saw someone walk past the window. So he sat up, and he looked outside, and he said, you saw someone walk past the window? Yes, dear. He sat there for a second. He didn't say anything. And then I heard a knock at the door. And I said, who's there? He looked at me, and I said, did you hear that? And he said, no, I didn't hear anything. I said, who's there? So he shouted, who's there?
What happened next?
Well, there were some men outside. And someone asked him, in a really strange voice. It was an older gentleman. We weren't quite sure how many were out there because we heard some whispering. Well, I heard some whispering. And decided that these men didn't sound very friendly, but they were asking for some directions. They wanted to know where Dutch Henry's house was.
What did you or your husband respond?
Well, my husband proceeded to give them the directions through the door as he was trying to find his breeches.
What happened next?
Well, he wanted to open the door, and I told him, do not open that door.
Then what happened?
Then the strangers insisted that he please open the door, that they needed him to come outside, and so he was said to them that he was going to try and turn on a light. And as he was trying to light the oil lamp, I begged him, please, please, do not open that door.
Then what happened?
You have some peculiar questions. So they stepped away from the door for a moment, and we heard some whispering. And then a moment later, we heard one of them ask if he was a Northern armist, to which he replied, yes, he was. I am, he said. And they said, you are a prisoner. Do you surrender?
And this was still through the door?
Yes, this was still through the door.
Then what happened?
And he said, gentlemen, yes, I do. But these were no gentlemen, we found out very soon. So after he made the light in the oil lamp, they said, you will open this door, or we will open it for you. So he did. He opened the door.
Describe to the jury what happened after the door was opened.
Well, after the door was opened, 4 gentlemen, not such gentlemen, walked through our door.
And were they armed?
They were armed, knives and pistols.
What happened?
Well, they sort of just barged their way right in, and there was an older gentleman, and he was not friendly at all. He was tall and thin and just dirty and smelly and bossy, very bossy, and telling everybody what to do. And there was a younger one who was kind of just running around, and I believe I saw him sitting out in the hallway waiting to testify. I think his name is Solomon.
And describe for me then.
I think it's a fish named Salmon, maybe.
The 4 men that came in, was one old and the rest were younger?
One was older, yes, and the rest were maybe in their 20s.
Who was doing the talking on their behalf?
Oh, the older man.
And describe the conversation he had with you.
Oh, he was not very pleasant at all. Like I said, I had been sick, very, very sick with the measles. Measles normally last a couple of weeks, and I'd been sick for about 10 days, so I was on the uphill, but I wasn't completely well. The rash was still there, the fever was still there a little bit, but
What were they saying to your husband?
well, they were telling him to get his clothes on, and they were, well, just being really bossy, really.
And when the older man was the one telling him to get his clothes on?
He did all the talking, all of it. And I begged him to let my husband stay. They were going to arrest him.
And who was it you were begging?
The older gentleman.
What was his response?
Well, he said no, they needed to take him. And when I begged him and told him that, well, I was very sick and I needed someone to care for me, they said no. And my husband said, I'll be here in the morning. If you just wait one day and come back, I'll be here in the morning.
Did your husband ask if they'd let him go try to find a neighbor to stay with you?
Well, that's exactly what we did. We asked if in the morning they could come back, and that would give him time to ride to the neighbors, get a neighbor to come back to care for me. But no, sir, he wouldn't have it.
And who was the older man that denied that request?
Oh, it was that man right over there.
And describe then what happened after that.
Well, then, when they were getting ready to leave, they told him to go ahead and get his breeches on. And as he got his clothes on, he tried to put his shoes on, and they wouldn't even let him put his shoes on. They just drug him out the door.
Who was it that he asked to put his shoes on?
Well, that man right over there.
And who was it that said no, he didn't need his shoes?
That man right there.
After they took him outside, did you go outside?
No, sir, I did not.
What did you do?
Well, I stayed in bed. I had a fever.
Now, was your husband armed in any way?
No, sir. They searched our house and they took the only shotgun that we had.
Did your husband throw any blows or any fight whatsoever?
No, he went voluntarily.
Now we have a photograph of your husband that's been marked State's Exhibit. Which number is Mr. Wilkinson? State's Exhibit 5. Your Honor, I'd offer that exhibit this time.
No objection, Your Honor.
I do miss that bushy mustache.
And can you identify State Exhibit 5 for the jury, please?
Yes, that's my Ellen.
After your husband went outside with that older man and the 3 younger men that were with him, did you ever see your husband alive again?
No, never, never.
In fact, did you ever see your husband again?
No, sir, no.
Are you familiar with the area, ma'am, where his body was found?
He was found about 150 yards from our house in some brush. Just dead.
And did you have a funeral for your husband?
Yes, they did.
When did that take place?
It was the next day.
And you see in this courtroom today the older man who did all the talking in your home, the one who made your husband go outside, the one who wouldn't even let your husband put on his shoes to go outside?
It was that wretched man right there.
Which man are you pointing at? There are two rather...
The ugly old man.
May the record reflect she's identified the defendant, Your Honor?
She did.
My husband was a quiet man. He was law-abiding.
Thank you, Ms. Wilkins.
Thank you. Cross-examination, counsel.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mrs. Wilkinson, the men who came to your door that night asked your husband if he was a Northern Armist, right?
They asked if he was what?
A Northern Armist?
Yes, they did.
And you took that to mean that he supported slavery, didn't you?
Well, I wasn't quite sure what that question meant. I thought that it was opposed to the Northern Free Soil Party. I cannot say that I really understood that question.
Okay, but you did take it to mean that he did not want Kansas to become a free state, correct?
Well, I didn't really understand what that question meant. I don't get into my husband's politics.
Your husband opened the door and 4 men came in. You testified.
Yes.
And then you also testified that your husband left with these men.
Yes.
But you weren't hurt during any of this, were you?
Oh, my God, my husband's been murdered.
But you weren't physically hurt during any of this, were you?
No, ma'am.
And you weren't physically threatened?
No, ma'am.
Okay. And your children weren't hurt, were they?
No.
And they weren't threatened?
No, ma'am.
Okay. So you stayed in the house after your husband left, correct?
Well, it was after midnight. It's not very safe for a woman to go out after dark.
So you never saw him again after he left the house?
No, ma'am.
So you didn't see him die?
No, ma'am.
So you don't know who killed him, do you?
I'm quite sure it was those 4 men.
But you didn't see that happen, did you?
No, ma'am.
You didn't even know for sure he was dead until you found his body the next morning, correct?
I did not find his body.
Well, until his body was found then, and you
That
received
is correct.
notification. Your husband believed in the institution of slavery very strongly, didn't he?
Yes, ma'am.
And he wanted to support it and preserve it.
Well, he was pro-slavery.
He was pro-slavery, though, to the extent that he wanted Kansas to be a slave state, didn't he?
Well, butter my biscuits, Miss Lindsay. I think I have testified to that.
All right, just let me make sure of that point, ma'am. So he made no secret of the fact that he was opposed to the free soil movement, did he?
Well, he didn't go over his beliefs with me in his what he believed politics-wise. We didn't discuss those matters at home. Those were manly conversations that he and his gentleman friend discussed.
But it was no big secret.
I couldn't say what his secrets were.
All right.
Can we have defense exhibits, please?
Mrs. Wilkinson, you at least paid attention enough to know that there was a legislative election in 1855, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, and your husband ran as a pro-slavery candidate during that election, didn't he?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, and there were pro-slavery Missourians who were cheating by stuffing the ballot boxes and intimidating voters. Isn't that correct?
Well, I don't know anything about that, ma'am.
All right, but you do know that the election results were in favor of pro-slavery ideas.
I don't know that, ma'am.
You don't know that your husband was elected?
I mostly stay at home and do my needle pointing.
So you didn't know that your husband was a member of the legislature?
Oh, yes, he was.
Okay, and you know that he was pro-slavery?
Yes, ma'am.
So you know that at least some pro-slavers were benefited by this election?
Well, I don't know anything about people stuffing ballot boxes. Did you see them do this?
Ma'am, I'm asking you if you knew that this election benefited pro-slavers. Now, is that yes or no?
I didn't really answer that question. I don't know anything about politics.
Even though your husband was pro-slavery, he was benefited by it.
Well, if you say so.
All right. And, Your Honor, at this point, I would move to admit Defense's Exhibit G. It is a list of members and officers of the First Legislative Assembly of the Kansas Territory.
No objection.
It will be admitted.
Thank you. Now, ma'am, if I can have you look at this. As I previously stated, this is a list of the members and officers of a legislator that was elected in 1855. Allen Wilkinson, that was your husband's name, wasn't it?
Yes, ma'am.
And he was pro-slavery, just as this indicates,
Yes, ma'am.
doesn't it? All right. He earned a salary from that position, didn't he?
Yes, ma'am.
So you and your family directly benefited from his pro-slavery views and the position he was able to gain by those views.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, he took an active part in the legislative body, didn't he?
I'm sorry?
Did he take an active part in the legislature?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So he took part in enacting laws.
Well, he went to work, if that's what you're asking.
Okay. But he wasn't lazy. You can assume that he did his job while he was at work.
Well, now, he was also a farmer. You can see that. So, no, he was not lazy.
All right. So, did you know that among the laws that your husband helped pass were laws that disqualified anyone with anti-slavery leanings from sitting on a jury or from even voting?
No, ma'am. I told you I do not participate in his politicking.
All right. Well, you do know that he was a postmaster as well, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And you know he was appointed to that office. And he was appointed after the election of 1855, correct?
Correct.
And he also earned a salary from that, didn't he?
Yes, ma'am.
So, once again, you and your family directly benefited from his pro-slavery views and the position that allowed him to gain.
Well, I like to say he got the job because he was the right man for the position.
But you and your family benefited from the job.
Well, if you say so.
Now, ma'am, your husband was a violent and imprudent man, wasn't he?
No, ma'am. He was a very kind and gentle man.
Oh, really? He never threatened to kill or to burn free staters?
Not to my knowledge.
And you never told him to be quiet whenever he was saying those things?
I would never tell my husband to be quiet.
Ma'am, Potawatomi is a fairly small community, isn't it?
Yes, ma'am.
And you know James Hanaway, who lives there. My understanding of Potawatomi is that everyone knows pretty much everyone else.
Yes, ma'am.
So you know James Hanaway. Did you know that he wrote in his own personal journal about how your husband was a violent and imprudent man?
Your Honor, object is, first of all, hearsay, second, irrelevant.
Will you rephrase that question?
Okay. Ma'am, you've already established that you knew James Hanaway.
Yes, ma'am.
That is correct. Okay. How well did you know him?
Not very well.
Okay. But you knew him well enough that he embraced negative views about your husband's temperament.
Well, I have heard such.
Okay, so why would he have those views if they weren't true?
Well, I don't know, ma'am.
Nothing further.
Thank you, counsel.
No redirect, Your Honor.
Thank you, Ms. Wilkinson. You are excused. Will counsel approach the bench? Okay, the prosecution will call its next witness.
Your Honor, at this time, the prosecution calls James Harris to the stand.
James Harris, will you approach the bailiff and be sworn?
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
So help me God.
Your Honor, if I might be heard, this gentleman, if I may call him such, has entered the court carrying a weapon. I didn't believe that was permissible in the United States District Court, even in 1857. I'd ask that he be disarmed.
Counsel, what is your purpose in carrying that weapon?
Well, just in case I need to protect myself,
Would you give your weapon to the bailiff, please?
I will.
May I have the prosecution exhibits? Now, could you please state your name for the jury?
Name's James Harris.
Mr. Harris, where did you live in May of 1856?
On Pottawatomie Creek down there in Kansas Territory.
Who lived there with you?
My wife and my child.
Could you describe for the jury who lived around you?
Well, Dutch Henry lived next door to me, and the Doyles and the Wilkinsons were across the creek.
Mr. Harris, could you describe what your views were on the issue of slavery?
Well, I got higher wages if there were slaves, so I enjoyed that.
Mr. Harris, I'd like to direct your attention to the night of May 24th, 1856. Do you remember this night?
Yes, sir.
And where were you that night?
I was in my home, and whilst I was lying in bed with my wife and my child, 3 men come in claiming to be the Northern Army.
Now, before these men entered your home, were there any other men staying with you?
Yes, sir. 3 men had stopped over. Bill Sherman, which is Henry Sherman's brother, had just bought a cow from him, so these men had stopped over, and the men with them were John S. Whiteman and the other fellow I didn't know.
I'm showing you what's been marked as a State's Exhibit 4. Do you recognize State's Exhibit 4?
Yes, sir.
And what is State's Exhibit 4?
That's Dutch Bill. That's Bill Sherman.
Your Honor, at this time, the prosecution would like to admit Exhibit 4 into evidence.
Any objection? Submitted.
Mr. Harris, do you know what Mr. Sherman's views on the issue of slavery were?
I believe he was pro-slavery, yes, sir.
And how old was Mr. Sherman?
Mr. Sherman was 35.
Now, back to what you were telling the jury about when the men entered your home. Could you describe that in more detail?
Well, they come in my home, and they had sabers. Each one of them had a saber and 2 revolvers. And they came in, and they said, "The Northern Army is upon you. It's useless to resist." Now, I wasn't so sure about that till they took our 2 rifles and Bowie knife we had in the room, my house being only 1 room. And then I figured resistance was futile.
Did you recognize any of the 3 men?
Yes, sir. I did. I recognized 2 of them. One of them, I don't know his given name, but he goes by the appellation of Old Man Brown. And the other one was his son, Owen.
Was Old Man Brown armed?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Now, Mr. Harris, I'm going to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 12. Now, does State's Exhibit 12 look like one of the weapons that Old Man Brown was carrying?
Yes, sir. This is a saber just like they had.
I'm also going to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 13. Now, does State's Exhibit 13 look like one of the weapons that Old Man Brown was carrying?
Yes, sir.
Now, Mr. Harris, what happened after these men had invaded your home and taken your weapons?
Well, then they ransacked the whole place for ammunition, right? And then they started taking us out and questioning us one by one.
Did these men question you?
They did.
And who was doing the questioning?
Well, they all questioned me.
Was Old Man Brown one of the questioners?
Yes, sir.
What were you asked about?
Well, they asked me if I'd ever aided any pro-slavery men into coming into the Kansas Territory. Had I had any hand in the last troubles at Lawrence? They asked me if there's any other men about the house, and I guess they didn't believe me because they went and checked. They asked where Dutch Henry was, and I told them he was out looking for lost cattle on the plains. They asked me if there was a bridle and saddle, and they took the saddle that I had, and then they took Dutch Henry's gray stallion that I had at my house.
So just so I can be clear for the jury, you were questioned about slavery and various slavery activities?
They asked me had I done the free state any harm or intended to.
Mr. Harris, were any of the other individuals staying in your home that night questioned?
Yes, sir.
Who else was questioned?
Well, they took that stranger out first, and he come back. Then they took me out. But when Old Man Brown and his son Owen took me into the house, then Old Man asked Bill Sherman to go outside with him. And actually another one of the Army men come inside. So there was 2 of them in there with the 4 of us, or the 3 of us, and they took Bill outside.
So Old Man Brown was outside with Mr. Sherman?
Yes, sir.
Did you hear anything while they were outside?
Hell, I didn't hear anything for about 15 minutes. And then, PAP! I heard a cat burst.
Mr. Harris, what happened after you heard this cat burst?
Well, then the other 2 Army men just left us.
Did you ever find out what happened to Mr. Sherman?
I did. So 10 o'clock in the morning, we felt safe to go out, and that's when I found Mr. Sherman dead in the creek by my house.
Could you describe for the jury what you saw when you found Mr. Sherman?
Well, Mr. Whiteman was with me, and we We pulled him out of the creek, and his skull was split in two places. And so his brains had been washed out by the creek a little bit, and there was a big hole cut in his chest. And they had cut off his left hand. So in that term, I guess he's all right. But other than that, he's dead, so we buried him.
Mr. Harris, did you come into my office and mark a diagram of these injuries?
Yes, sir, I did.
I'm showing you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 9. Is this the diagram that you marked?
Yes, sir.
Now, could you describe for the jury what injuries you marked on this diagram?
Well, there's where his skull was split in two places, and that's where he got cut in the chest, a big hole in his breast, and then that's his left hand cut off. They left a little piece of skin on the left hand.
Your Honor, the prosecution will move this exhibit into evidence. Exhibit 9.
Any objections?
No objection, Your Honor.
Submitted.
Now, Mr. Harris, is the person that you called Old Man Brown who took Mr. Sherman out just before you heard the gunshot, is that man present in court today?
Yes, sir.
Could you point him out for the jury?
Right there.
Could you describe what this Old Man Brown is wearing tonight?
Yes, sir. He's got looks like a green or dark colored jacket, and some light colored pants and dark boots.
Yeah, let the record reflect that the witness has identified the defendant.
Defendant was identified. Cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Harris, you were inside whenever William Sherman was taken outside, weren't you?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. And you remained inside, didn't you?
Yes.
Okay. And then you found him dead the next morning you testified?
But it's the same morning, really.
Okay. But you didn't see who killed him?
No.
Okay. And you weren't there whenever he died? You were not outside with him?
No.
Okay. Now, none of your family was hurt that night, were they?
No, ma'am.
Okay. And there were two other men in your house besides William Sherman, you said?
Yes, ma'am.
Neither of them were hurt, were they?
No, ma'am.
All right. Now, you were taken outside, you testified, and you were questioned by the men who came to your house. And you told them that you had never taken any hand in aiding pro-slavery men and coming to the territory of Kansas, didn't you?
That's correct. They told me if I said no, they'd let me loose.
Okay, but that was the answer that you indicated to them, that you had never taken a part in that.
That's why I'm sitting here today.
All right. And you also indicated that you had never taken any hand in the last troubles at Lawrence.
That's correct.
And you indicated that you had never done the Free State Party any harm, and you didn't intend to do any harm to that party.
That's correct.
All right. And they didn't hurt you, did they?
No, they did not.
So they kept their words.
They did.
Now, in April of 1855, Judge Sterling Cato set up court at your neighbor's house, didn't he?
Yes.
And this neighbor is Henry Sherman?
Yes.
And he goes by Dutch Henry sometimes?
That's right.
All right. Now, the purpose of this court was to issue warrants for locals who were speaking and acting against slavery, wasn't it?
That's right.
All right. And you knew William Sherman, didn't you?
Yes.
All right. And you knew his brother Henry?
Oh, yes.
Okay. And he and his brother both held very strong pro-slavery views, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
All right. And in fact, William Sherman's views were so strong that he had threatened repeatedly to shoot Free Staters, hadn't he?
Yes, he had.
And he had threatened to exterminate Free Staters repeatedly.
Yes, he had.
All right. He also threatened to harm a Free Stater named Theodore Weiner, didn't he?
Right.
All right. And Mr. Weiner lived in Potawatomi and owned a store there, correct?
Yeah, in Bill's defense, he was drunker than a skunk that day.
But he still did it, didn't he?
He did.
And he had a habit of drinking, didn't he?
Yeah.
All right. Now, additionally, Mr. Sherman raised a red flag when he heard that Lawrence was being attacked, didn't he?
He's intimating if it's war, he's in for it.
All right. And so he admitted to you that the purpose of the flag was to show that he was for the war against Lawrence.
That's what he meant.
Nothing further.
Thank you, counsel. Redirect.
No, Your Honor.
Thank you very much. The witness is excused. To accommodate the court, there will be a 15-minute recess. The jury is instructed to come up these stairs, not speak with any party or any attorney, and you will be directed out to the jury conference room. The rest will be in recess for approximately 15 minutes. You are asked to stay in or near the courtroom. We will proceed in 15 minutes.
All rise.